It's gonna be an in-depth April reading wrap-up plus my May TBR. I did post a April reading wrap-up on TikTok, but it's kind of hard to go in depth when you only have like the 3 minutes. Yeah, let's jump right into it. I like to start out with my reading stats. So I read 7.5 books, which was a little under my goal for the month. I was trying to read like 8 or 9. I think last April I read 10. And total that was 2,436 pages. And of these books, I read 3 contemporary romance, 2 YA fantasy, 1 literary fiction, and then 2 dark contemporary romances that I'm not really sure how to classify the genre. In no particular order, let's get into it. So I actually did start the month off with Hopeless by Colleen Hoover. 2 things about this book. This was the final Colleen Hoover book that I planned to read that I hadn't read yet. She has some others that I haven't read but I don't plan to read. And then second, when I ordered this from Amazon, it showed the picture of the new cover. And when I received it, I have the ugly old cover, but I didn't feel like going through the process of returning it, so I just kept this one. This is obviously a contemporary romance, as most of her books are. It was interesting because the main characters were high schoolers, but it wasn't YA by any means. This deals with some really heavy topics, so definitely check trigger warnings if you're planning on reading this. I really didn't know what to expect going into it. I didn't know what it was about, but I surprisingly really enjoyed it. The relationship in this book is very, very toxic, plus they're high schoolers. It just kind of felt a little bit strange, them being the age they were and the behaviors they had, but I wasn't mad about it. I still liked the book and it had some really great plot twists. I wouldn't say this is like my favorite one of hers by any means, but definitely not my least favorite. I gave this, I think, 4 or 4.5 stars. Then I read 2 books I was never planning on reading, but on TikTok, everyone blew up my comments saying I had to read these novellas after Hopeless, which Hopeless does have a follow-up book, I think, Losing Hope, but I read somewhere that it's the exact same story just from the guy's perspective, and I honestly didn't like it enough to want to totally reread the story. But I did pick up the novellas and I have read All Your Perfects, which I had heard these connect Hopeless to All Your Perfects. The first one is Finding Cinderella, which follows the best friend from the characters in Hopeless. It's from the perspective of this new character, and honestly, he got on my nerves so bad. I thought this book was really cheesy. It honestly just felt immature and storyline felt kind of pointless to me. I just feel like I could have done without reading it. I gave this 2 stars, if even that. It really wasn't awful, but I feel like the only reason you would need to read this is if you really loved Hopeless and like were obsessed with all the characters. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste of time. Thankfully, it was really short, but it didn't add anything to the story for me. I almost would have preferred it if she would have done a whole other book for these characters. Then I read Finding Perfect, which is an even smaller novella. And once again, kind of same thoughts about this that I had about Finding Cinderella. I just didn't really see the point. It did connect Hopeless to All Your Perfects, which I thought was really cool, but I wasn't super invested in the story. I was really thankful it was short because I didn't need what was in this. Also gave this like 1 or 2 stars. This is just the month of like toxic relationships in romance books because I read the first 2 books in the Ravenhood trilogy, Flock and Exodus. I picked this up because I'd literally just seen it all over TikTok, people saying it was great and that they cried. I had no clue what it was about and I had no clue what the genre was, and looking at the cover, not gonna lie, I thought it was a fantasy. Even the back, like the synopsis on the back, gives nothing away about the characters or the plot or the setting even, so I was super confused going into this. I honestly considered DNFing it because I disliked the female main character so much, but then it took a huge twist. I did not see what was coming in this book. I was not expecting how out of pocket this was gonna be. The relationships in this were so toxic and so awful, but somehow I still kind of liked the book. Definitely look up trigger warnings and like content warnings before reading this because I was shocked when I read this. I enjoyed it enough to read the second one, but I gave this like a 4 stars with a question mark. Part of me was like, I hate this book. The relationships are so toxic. I can't stand the characters. Part of me was like so invested. I went with 4 stars. Then I read Exodus, which was the second one. This one, for the probably first entire half, I was kind of bored, not bored enough to stop reading the book, but I just felt like the plot wasn't really going anywhere, and the two love interests from the first book like weren't even in this book hardly at all, which I didn't like because I really enjoyed both of them. But then I did start to like it, and there was some really shocking plot twists at the end. Once again, look up trigger warnings and look up content warnings, but this made me cry. It's definitely not the typical genre I read. I also gave this one 4 stars, and I will be reading the 3rd one. Then I read my book of the month box pick, which is a romantic comedy, and this book, I don't want to use the word hate, but I would have been better off if I didn't read this, which I never thought I would say about a book. I picked this out as my selection for book of the month, mostly because the cover is really pretty, and I thought it would look pretty on my shelf. It's technically a literary fiction, but obviously the title would lead you to believe it is romantic and comical. It was neither of those things. The characters in this were so boring. The plot made no sense. The timeline of the book was all over the place. This is basically about SNL script writers, except it's not SNL, but it's like based on that, like comedy sketch writers, and the premise of that sounded really interesting to me, but it just honestly wasn't executed very well. The characters in this book are like older adults, but they were written like teenagers, or like the author was trying to make them seem hip and cool, and just the way it was written, I really just didn't like it. I've seen so many people say they love it, but it was not for me. I think I gave it 1 star only because I was able to finish it. Also, second half of the book takes place during COVID, and that came out of nowhere. Like, it just didn't make sense to the plot. I felt like there was too much trying to be thrown in there to make it like cool and hip and relatable. It just was terrible. I didn't like it. I'm sorry. I also read Shadow and Bone, the first book in the Grishaverse. I think this trilogy is technically the beginning of the Grishaverse. I watched this show when it first came out on Netflix, and I really liked it, and I'd always planned on like reading these books at some point or another, but I never had got around to it until I found these in a used bookstore and kind of just took that as my opportunity to own the books. And then with the 2nd season coming out, I was gonna watch it, but I was like, you know, I should probably read the books before I watch the 2nd season. So I picked up the first book and read it, and honestly I felt like I was reading it for a second time because I'd already seen the show and I remembered like what happened. So this was a very easy read for me, just because I almost felt like I could skim the book, but in a good way, because the information just clicked and made sense. Whereas with most fantasies, when you first start them, you're still kind of learning the lingo and the places, just like the world building and politics. Like, there's so much to understand and set up before you can really get into the plot. But after seeing the show, I already knew what all of that stuff was, so it made it really easy for me to get into it. So I finished this one super fast. I enjoyed it. I absolutely love Leigh Bardugo's writing style. It's very whimsical and magical and immersive, and overall just very easy to read. I think even if I hadn't watched the show before this, it would have been a very easy read for me, just because it sucks you in and you really feel like you're a part of the story. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but it is a YA fantasy with like a touch of romance. My only complaint about this book, if you put a morally gray, dark, tall, handsome character in a book, how are you gonna expect me to not like him? And I wasn't supposed to like him, I think. He's the bad guy. He's probably my favorite character in the entire book, but then he was an actual villain. And I'm like, no, can he please be a love interest? And he wasn't. So that's my only complaint, but I really enjoyed it. It was super good. I gave it 4 stars. And then the book I'm halfway through right now is Siege and Storm, which is the 2nd book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I'm about 260 pages. I will say this was like, I read this one right after romantic comedy, and so romantic comedy put me in a huge slump because I hated that book so much. So I don't think I'm going through this one as fast as I would have if I would have went straight into it from the first book. I'm really enjoying it. Obviously I haven't seen the 2nd season, so I didn't have like prior knowledge of this plot, but so far I'm loving it. Now for my May TBR, I'm gonna try and go through this really quick. I will say I know there's no way I'm going to read all of these books. It's just not gonna happen. These are just the ones that I hope I'm going to read in May, or the ones I'll be like thinking about reading in May. I am a little bit of a mood reader, so I'm sure some of these I will totally skip, and there'll be other books that I end up reading that I wasn't planning on reading. So first I want to finish the Grishaverse and read Ruin and Rising, not finish the Grishaverse. Finish the Shadow and Bone series, because I do still have to read the Sex of Crows duology. I also want to finish the Ravenhood trilogy and read The Finish Line. Then next, I'm going to try and read Things We Hide from the Light, the second book in the Things We Never Got Over / the Knock 'Em Out trilogy, I think it's gonna be. I also want to read Daisy Jones and the Six. Now listen, I know everyone's already read this book, and I can't bring myself to watch the show until I've read the book. I'm gonna try and read this in May. Then I also picked up 2 Emily Henry books that I surprisingly haven't read yet, and those are Beach Read and People We Meet on Vacation. I've only read Book Lovers by her, and I do want to read Happy Place, but I'm just waiting for it to come out in paperback. But I thought these would be 2 great books to kind of kick off like my summer vacation, because I get out of school really soon, and I just wanted like some fun romance, like beachy books. Next, I have Defy Me and Imagine Me, which are the last 2 books in the Shatter Me series. I've read the first 3 Shatter Me books multiple times. I read them in high school, and then I reread them last year, and then I read the 4th one, which is Restore Me, I think. And then I saw spoilers for this book. Maybe it's this one. And there was a trope that I hate. I never got these 2 books. I never got around to reading them because I was like, I'm just gonna pretend the series ends after Ignite Me, because that book was literally perfection and I don't want anything else bad to happen. Like, I just want Juliet and Warner to be happy. Seeing people finishing the series and reading it and saying it's good and that they like the ending, so I gave in and I bought these 2, and a year later I'm finally going to actually finish it. I'm not going to read the novellas because I feel like I'm too far in at this point to go back and read all of them. Then I plan to read Vow of Thieves. I read Dance of Thieves over a year ago and somehow just never got around to finishing the duology. Then I also plan to read Fourth Wing. I actually just got sent this is an advanced reader copy, and yeah, I'm so excited to read it. It looks amazing. All I know is it's a fantasy and it's about dragons. Plus, I've heard so many people talking about it, saying how good it is. So this I 100% will be reading in May. So that's actually only 10 books on my TBR, and last May I read 13 books. So I'm hoping to match the 13 books. If you guys want to see more YouTube style book related content, I would love to make more videos. Bye guys!